One of the great benefits of breath prayers and praying without ceasing is that they help us to redefine certain ways of thinking about prayer in general. And so on Wednesday, I talked about how sometimes we think of God often as very distant or far off and removed from the day-to-day workings of the world. Like God's off in the heavens somewhere, not really influencing reality in any meaningful way. So sometimes when we pray, it almost feels like we're writing a letter to God, but He's so infinitely far away from us that our message will just never get to Him. So we kind of think, well, what's the point, right? Well, when we think about prayer, not in terms of these kind of isolated moments where we talk at God, that perceived distance or space can be removed. Because again, like we talked about on Wednesday, breath prayer reorients God, not in space, not somewhere far away from us, but in our hearts. And there's nothing closer to us than the heart, right? So breath prayer helps us, it helps keep us conscious of God's perpetual presence within us. God's always near, and God is always accessible. So I also briefly want to address a commonly occurring pitfall in breath prayer, which is just saying the words without any real effect. It's just mindless repetition. So ideally, we want to avoid not thinking about or feeling the impact of what we're doing. But I want to suggest that mindless repetition isn't always a terrible thing, or at least when it comes to this. So there's this wonderful story of two Jewish rabbis who are talking, and one of them is very sad because he's saying that one of his disciples has abandoned him and abandoned his Torah, which is, the biblical law, right? And his interpretation of the biblical law. Well, and he says something interesting. He says, if only they had abandoned me and kept my Torah. If only they had kept it, then the starter dough, which is basically the stuff within it, its teachings, would have brought them back to me. Then he says, study Torah, even if it's not for its own sake. From the very fact that you're studying it and involving yourself in it, you will turn back to it for its own sake. Now, that story is about Torah and the Bible and not about prayer, but I think that it can still help us anyway. So what this essentially means for us is that the very words of the prayers that we're saying, and I've talked about the Jesus prayer specifically, but with breath prayer, the very words and the very action of practicing praying without ceasing, even if it's just an empty ritual for us, it can help transform us regardless of our motivation or intent, and that our motivations can eventually, through the repetition of it, can become pure and honest. So it all boils down to, really, even if you think, this is dumb, or my heart really isn't into it, or I don't feel like I'm getting anything from it, do it anyway. Because it might just end up working on your heart and transforming your heart, and it can become meaningful for you, even if you don't feel it.